Let's switch gears. We're now going to go to the case out of Texas. This is the Roy Oliver trial. We've been following it closely. I was with you last week covering this trial. This is a case that is now in verdict watch. We have so much analysis to do, to dissect. The defense put on a great case. The defendant even took the stand. For those of you just joining us who may not know, this is the case where the white police officer, former officer now, pulled his rifle on a car full of teenagers and shot and killed an innocent 15-year-old child, a straight-A student into sports, great kid. The question is not whether or not it was right or wrong to shoot the kid. We all know it was wrong. But whether or not it was reasonable under the circumstances, there he is on the screen, that beautiful face, that sweet smile, whether or not it was reasonable under the circumstances to react in a way as a first responder to pull the trigger that night at that moment under the chaos that was going on. It was dark outside. There was a party. There were gunshots across the street. There was a gunman at large. Was it reasonable for the officer under those circumstances to react that way? Let's have some analysis. We have a reporter for Law and Crime. Her name is Tiffinni Young, and she has been reporting for us on scene, and I want to ask some questions. Tiffinni, thank you for joining us.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Good. So we're in verdict watch right now. Is there anything that you can give us as an update as you roam the hallway there?
Yes, so a couple of things. One, we did finally get kind of an official breakdown of the jury. So I want to make sure I get that correct. There are 3 Hispanic females, 5 white females, 2 black females, and 2 white men. And then there were 2 white males that are serving as alternates. And so we did get that official breakdown.
I know you just broke down male and female, but can you break down the race again? How many are black? How many are Hispanic? How many are white?
There are 2 black females, and then you're going to have 3 Hispanic females. And then there are 7 white jurors.
7 white jurors. Okay. So as a former prosecutor, I know here, you know, when we had a case with black defendant, we would not want Hispanic jurors because they always had, at least where I was, they had feuds and competing gangs, and it wasn't always favorable for the defendant just based on race alone. Do you feel that the composition of the jury panel that you see there, and you see their faces, we don't really see that here while we watch the trial on the network, that there's in any way a favoritism towards the officer or the victim's family in this case?
Well, I will tell you the jury has been great at keeping poker faces throughout this time. What I can tell you is when the state has made their closing arguments, and then at certain times during the state's case in chief, we have seen some, and in the opening argument, in the opening statement, we have seen some jurors who have gotten emotional. You have 10 women, 2 men. There is also one of the women on the jury, she is pregnant at the time as well. I just found out a couple of days ago. And so certainly you've seen some of these defendants today as the state's attorney, Assistant DA Snipes was closing out. He finished the closing argument and he was, you know, really talking about and pointing out the defendant, and you did this, you killed Jordan, and you felt the emotion in the courtroom. You saw some of the jurors, quite frankly, showing emotion today.
And where did you see the emotion from the jurors? We don't really see that, like I said, with the cameras here. Did you? At what point were they exhibiting? Because at first you said they were poker face. Now they have some emotion. That could give some insight on where the verdict's going. However, we've been under verdict watch for a while now, which usually means there's not a consensus in that deliberations room. We don't know which way it's going to go, but it's the fast verdicts is everybody unanimously agrees, and we need a unanimous verdict. So where did they not show? Where was emotion showed?
The emotion was at the moment that the assistant DA, Mike Snipes, was talking about the defendant killed you. This defendant killed Jordan Edwards. At that point, you began to see emotion as the victim, Jordan Edwards' photo was shown. Snipes started out with the smiling photo that you just showed of Jordan Edwards, and then he moved on to the photo of Jordan Edwards in the car in a deceased state. And at that point, we began to hear emotion from Jordan Edwards' family, who was there in the courtroom today. Some of his football teammates were in the courtroom today as well. And so you saw some emotion from the jury at that point, as well as we saw emotion from Jordan Edwards' friends and family that were there in the public gallery.
Okay, and you were there for closing arguments. I saw some closing arguments as well today, and it looks like the defense did a pretty decent job poking holes in the prosecution's case, saying that it has to be 100% reasonable, and you can't you have to have 100% of any reasonable doubt. You can't have any reasonable doubt. Do you feel that the jurors were listening to that, or do you feel that the jurors bought the prosecution's case that this officer was just trigger happy and aggressive? We have two components: aggression and trigger happy.
Right, and that's something we've been talking about in the hallways. It's been really hard to gauge kind of where the jury is on that. During the closing argument from the defense, all three of the defendant's attorneys did participate in the closing argument, and the last attorney for the defendant who spoke last was Jim Lane, and he did have the defendant to stand up. And really kind of began to run down, he was raised by the single mother. He volunteered to be in the military. And you had a defendant who looked down most of that time, didn't really make eye contact with the jury. And so at that point is when we were kind of looking at the jury to see what types of emotions they may have been showing. And at that point, you really didn't necessarily get a read one way or another that they were sympathetic to the defendant or that they were not sympathetic to the defendant. But they have been a jury that has been intense, and they have been up and aware and paying attention to what's going on. For the most part, I think all of the jurors I've noticed, they have really been paying attention and hanging kind of on the words of both prosecution and the defendant's cases.
Let me ask you something else. You were in the courtroom, and when we were in the court, okay, we're going to have to go to a break. All right. I wanted to ask you about the family because I wanted to know what their reaction was. I did see how they stepped out of the courtroom when they showed some gruesome pictures, and I wanted to know what their response was and their reaction was, but I don't think you have time to respond to it. So maybe when we get back from the break, you can answer that question because I don't want to cut you off. For those just joining us, this is the case out of Texas. This is the Roy Oliver trial where the former officer is standing trial for murder of a 15-year-old. We'll be right back. Stick with us. We'll be just a few minutes. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Carissa Kranz, and we are here to continue coverage of the Roy Oliver case out of Texas. 2017 case where a former officer is standing trial for the murder of a 15-year-old. The question is, there he is on the screen. That's the officer that's standing trial. That's the defendant. White officer, black defendant. The question is, was it reasonable under the circumstances? Not whether it was right or wrong, but was it reasonable under the circumstances to pull the trigger and shoot and kill this kid? He was a kid, 15 years old. There were a lot of circumstances going on at the time. There his face is on the screen, straight A student, into sports, good kid. But there was a house party that night. There were a couple hundred kids there. There was a shooting across the street. It was dark outside. It was two officers outnumbered by a lot of commotion. And the question is, was it reasonable to shoot or not? The prosecution says he was trigger happy and aggressive and brought in testimony of aggression, improving previous aggression through rebuttal witnesses. And the defense says, nope, it was completely reasonable under these circumstances. It was a lot of chaos. He's a good guy. He's a public servant. He's a veteran. Before the break, I was with Law and Crime's reporter Tiffinni Young, who's been covering this trial with me, and I cut her off because I had to go to that break. And I wanted to ask you, Tiffinni, you've been looking at the jurors, and you've been looking at the family, because you're there. We don't always get to control where the cameras go and what angle it picks up. You gave us good insight on the jury, but what about the family members? How are they responding to everything, to certain pictures that are being put up on the screen, to prosecution's closing, to defense closing, to even the defendant taking the stand himself? What do you see on the family members' faces?
I tell you, you can see some raw emotion coming from the friends and the family. As you mentioned before the break, during the trial, the family, we would see the family members sometimes coming in and out of the trial, as that those pictures were possibly being shown and different things were happening. Today, during the closing arguments, we found that the doors were locked, so there was no in and out at the judge's orders. Once you were in, you were in. So the family was in there to see the photo. And I made a note here that as Assistant District Attorney Snipes, he first showed the smiling picture of Jordan, and then he shows the picture of Jordan in the car, and he says, "This is him, the young man you see in the blue shirt." And he stops the frame of the body cam at that moment and says he didn't know at that time that he only had 10 seconds to live. And then you see the picture of Jordan. It was at that point that the family began to hear crying from the family and friends on that side, where his family, and as I said, some of the football teammates and quite frankly, some community members as well were sitting on that side.
So you heard this crying during closing arguments?
Yes, so it was throughout the closing arguments, but I would say that was probably the one moment where I made the note that the family really began to feel that emotion, and we heard it audibly as they were crying throughout the courtroom, passing tissue to them so that they could wipe tears.
Well, it's so great to have you in the courtroom giving us this extra insight, because you are certainly picking up on things that we just don't see as viewers, or even in the control room here. We are limited on what we can actually see and pick up in the human sensory emotions, but we do have that live feed there, and we do try to get everything we can. But you, being there in person, have special insight on the jurors' faces and the families' reactions. So with that being said, let's go to prosecution's closing arguments and take a look and see what we can pick up here as viewers. And if we can see and hear, let's listen in. Let's see if we can hear the family's response. Let's take a look.